All right, well, let's get back after it. As advertised on our course website today, today's class is optional. If you need this time to go vote, then go vote. That's really serious. Like, it's important to vote. And it's not my place as a state employee at all to tell you how to vote, of course. Not anybody's place to tell you how to vote, but
When does the voting place close? I forgot.
polls are
Six
up
to
until
six,
7?
6 to 7, I think.
They're open pretty late. It's definitely dark, full dark by the time they close off. Yeah.
And there's one in the student center.
Awesome.
We're in the student center, right? Seven to playing.
Probably the ballroom.
It's right next to the university bookstore, like the merchandise store. I voted there last week.
Awesome.
It's right outside.
For anybody voting by mail, I think as long as your ballot is postmarked or certified by signature by today's date, then you can still send it in and it'll get counted sort of after the fact, but it still gets counted for sure. So if anybody needs to step out to go vote, then absolutely go do that with my blessing, and thank you for voting. For the rest of us, let's keep on roundhouse kicking. Cool. All right, so we've been talking about, we're now into the second half of the 1800s, talking about the history of forestry, the history of forest recreation management, and kind of what are the big movements across human history that got us to where we are today with respect to things like why do we do forest recreation the way that we do? Really, in the past 50 years, things have been utterly different than all of the thousands of years of human recreation before that. And so we're in a really unique time, even right now, which keeps park rangering really interesting and fresh and dynamic. This is not a stodgy, dusty kind of career path, but it also means that there's some meaningful challenges. And a lot of these challenges are going to start to have their recognizable, like direct traced roots or lineage back to kind of this post-Civil War, so post-1865 time. So we've been talking about, in kind of broad strokes, the westward march of settler-style development and so forth across sort of the middle states of the United States. So in this time, right, the East Coast and West Coast are connected by rail, right, with the Golden Spike in the middle. And we had been sort of finishing up class last time on Thursday talking about 1864 George Perkins Marsh's book of Man and Nature. And again, that was just kind of alerting everybody to this heads-up idea of, hey, with the industrial logging we can do, the through-going clear cutting that we can do across entire states, as big as New York. New York's a pretty big state. That has consequences for our drinking water. It has consequences, of course, for the wildlife and so forth. And yes, we're absolutely capable of doing this, and we're working so hard on doing it that relatively few people are stopping to ask, should we do this? And so George Perkins Marsh, while the country is admittedly sort of tied up with some other things, you know, brother against brother in the Civil War in 1864, and coming up on things like the assassination of Lincoln and Reconstruction in the South and all of this stuff, right? As all of that is happening, the West is still being developed and explored out from under First Nations folks there. And of course, around the mid-1800s, we have the continuing effects of the scientific revolution, which really got started in the 1700s. Now it's starting to get ahead of steam, under it, pun intended, where we have researchers like Charles Darwin putting out books like The Origin of Species. Now, Charles Darwin was not the only person who was thinking along these lines. Other naturalists at that time, they would have been called, other naturalists, people who study multiple disciplines across what are now sort of finally divided things like geology, paleontology, paleobotany, and so forth, right? We have a lot of specialization now. Back then, researchers tended to be a little bit more along the lines of generalists. And we would call those naturalists these days for folks who are doing things outdoors. So Charles Darwin sails on the HMS Beagle I believe, which was a whaling ship, and goes to, anybody know what island chain?
Galapagos.
The Galapagos, very good. And notices a whole bunch of interesting characteristics and features and divergences among bird species and land reptile species and so forth. And essentially races to the press with his first manuscript of The Origin of Species. Now, culturally speaking, this was a really big deal for Darwin and his competitors or colleagues, depending on how you view them, for them to be doing something like this. So this is before a time when there's like the pop science publishing industry. So now you can go to a Barnes & Noble and their entire racks of books all about things like the cosmos and things like the psychology and self-help section of every major bookstore and library, right? None of that stuff existed back then. It was not a thing. We're still into, but not done with, the scientific revolution, sort of taking the reins on the public discourse, the public discussion about where did we come from? What is the origin of species, or the origin of speciation, right? So again, the dominant narrative for the past couple of thousand years is that, well, back in the book of Genesis, God created all of these different, not species, but kinds of animals. And if God created them as an aardwolf, an addax, an agama, an agouti, etc., on down the list of animals, well then evolution can't be a thing because they were already created as those discrete things, right? So this is a source of real internal strife and debate and reflection for Charles Darwin, who was himself, at that time, a devout Christian, right? So imagine what it's like to stand up to all of Western society and say, hey, the story that you have been told for the last 100 generations at least isn't exactly what the evidence is showing, right? He agonized over this for months and years, and finally only published it because one of his colleagues was going to publish a similar theory, but with less substantial support, less evidence, and so forth in it. And so that helped to move us to more of a mechanistic understanding of the world, right? So we have around the same time of Man and Nature saying that, yeah, humans are capable of destroying or shutting down the ecological functions, the ecosystem services that we've all been kind of taken for granted up to this point in the mid-1800s. And indeed, some of the very first anthropologists, people who study people in the largest groups, so like studying an entire society, studying an entire ancient civilization, for example, that's kind of the work of anthropologists at this time. They are starting to turn up some examples of cultures that have collapsed. And that is something that doesn't necessarily jive with sort of the creation mindset or narrative of things. And so in the mid to late 1800s, there's a lot of public discussion about this stuff, where people would literally meet over coffee, for example, in the town square, or more commonly over tea, and have conversations about this stuff. Yeah, just picked up a copy of Origin of Species. You're talking with your neighbor from the other side of Boston or whatever in the town square, and you're like, wow, this is a banger. It's some interesting ideas. This is lit, or fire, fam. In so many words. They probably didn't use those words back then, right? And so we get this interesting transformation of the Catholic Church, for example, describing everything as created and specified at once during creation, way back in the day, versus now the Catholic Church has an enormous science and research apparatus. They run astronomic observatories, and they have all kinds of geneticists and researchers of all different stripes. It's amazing, sort of the switch, the peripatetic but just change or growth in understanding and worldviews from this time specifically. So if any of you guys are real curious about this, sort of this moment in human history where we switch from a religious primary underpinning of how the world works to a mechanistic ecological one, increasingly, stop by my office after class. I've got a 6th edition of Origin of Species, printed in 1872, and you can hold and read a bit of history in that way. Also around this time, we have the invention of some sports. Right? Golf was not always a thing. And granted, it's kind of a boomer sport now, and it's mostly, for retirees and so forth, people who could afford houses back when that was a thing, right? Most of us now are struggling to afford houses. And golf is reflective of our growing understanding and, importantly, our capacity to not just have, like, flower gardens, not just to have city parks, but to have not just tamed green spaces in or near a town, but deeply manicured, turfed, utterly conquered greenscapes that you can play a sport on, like golf, right? So think of how specific and sort of landscaped and planed, smooth and clean and manicured and, every square inch of a golf course, a nice one, having to be just groomed like that. And there's a ton of work, and these days even a ton of science, so turf management, that goes into running golf courses. Very, very specific fertilizer and water and organic material and soil composition, soil textures needed to run a nice golf course, especially in difficult environments. Like, has anybody ever flown into like Phoenix or Tucson or any of these southwestern big cities, right? When you fly over Tucson or Phoenix or any of these, and you look out the window of the plane, when you look down, it's brown. It is literal Sonoran or Mojave Desert, depending on which state you're flying over. And then there's like this concentric set of circles and rings of each of these cities with green lawns and golf courses in particular. So think of what a flex it is on or against Mother Nature to have golf courses by the dozens and hundreds in major arid environment cities. Like, that's extremely, extremely intensive taming, reshaping, reworking, forcing natural processes to conform to a very, very specific aesthetic or ideal or facility need for a very specific, specified kind of thing like golf. Okay? By 1880, even before widespread adoption of things like internal combustion engines and before we have things like World War II era synthetic fertilizers, taken from the technology needed to turn nitrogen and nitrate into bombs, right? Now we turn it into fertilizer, and some terrorists take fertilizer and turn it into bombs. We've now reached that spot in human history, right? So golf is originally a Scottish invention, but it's imported to the United States culturally and really, really takes off here. We're also getting fully into, now in the late 1800s, the perfusion, or I guess diffusion of military technologies, so guns. And around this time, we're getting the first fully self-contained and waterproof cartridges, right? So brass casings and stuff like that, instead of paper-wrapped gunpowder charges that you're pouring down the mouth of your musket and so forth. We're getting things like rifling, which gyroscopically stabilize the bullet or the slug on its way out of the barrel. And these rapid technological advancements make things like the Civil War way more deadly than they would have been otherwise, right? Thousands of people getting killed in major battles each day instead of maybe a few hundred. Because the accuracy, the range, and the stopping power of firearms sort of underwent kind of a quantum leap right before the Civil War, and the tactics had not. So we're fighting War of 1812 style tactics with Civil War era killing power technologies, and those things get diffused out towards hunting. And so with cities like Chicago growing like weeds, cities like St. Louis, for example, both on the great Mississippi Flyway, cities like New Orleans, Louisiana, right? Rapid population growth. And again, we don't have synthetic fertilizers, we don't have genetically modified corn to increase agricultural productivity. So we get a lot more calories a lot faster by using military-grade hunting technology back then. And we shoot something like 10 billion passenger pigeons just out of that species alone. We shoot it to extinction over the course of a couple of decades, right? So these days, the aliens that find planet Earth, a million years from now or whatever, we're going to be recorded geologically as a thin layer of microplastics and chicken bones encoded into the geologic column. Like we consume billions of chickens a day as a species now. Back then, it was wild passenger pigeons and other similar species, right? So you wouldn't get chicky nuggies with honey mustard sauce. You were getting passenger pigeon nuggies with whatever sauce they ate in the 1880s, okay? And so you can feed an entire city of a couple of million people back then by doing this. But it's like our logging up in New York State, like our draining the Mississippi Basin in places like the Boot Heel of Missouri around this time and clear cutting all that timber. It's absolutely unsustainable. So we don't have in our vocabulary yet as a country basic ideas that we use every day without even thinking about it in forestry at this time. Things like conservation. We got 10 billion passenger pigeons. We don't need to worry about conservation, right? We've got tens of millions of bison, these enormous, like bigger than cattle-sized thingies that taste delicious. We're not gonna run out of them until we do. And that really starts to come to a head in 1890. So in 1890, that's the year when a lot of things happen. In 1890, the United States Census declares the western frontier, the wild, wild west, is now closed. It is largely, uniformly, but sparsely settled from coast to coast now, right? We now have all of the territories pretty well established and people moving to them to get that 40 acres and a mule, to cut down that woodlot, to put up a homestead, and to start getting all of those nutrients, all of that mineral extraction, etc., all those board feet of timber, back out to those cities on the coasts and in Chicago and so forth. Okay? So, if any of you guys are familiar with Buffalo Bill Cody, anybody ever heard that name? All right, how do you know the name Buffalo Bill Cody? Who was that? Aside from like a Looney Tunes character. Does anybody still watch Looney Tunes? That was old when I was a kid. All right.
Looney Tunes is great.
Say again?
Looney Tunes is great.
Looney Tunes is great. Thank you. A+. All right. So, Buffalo Bill Cody, in part, rose to fame. He would be like, if any of you guys watched like OLN or anything like that, he would be like the Ted Nugent of his day, right? So, kind of the coked out public figure. I have no evidence that Buffalo Bill Cody used cocaine, but anyway. Buffalo Bill Cody would basically take people on not celebrity cruises, but celebrity train rides. Back in the day, we didn't have cruise ships. We don't have internal combustion engines, not really yet. Not in the way that you and I understand them. We had steam engines, but you would take people on these train rides across the country. So you'd like all meet up in St. Louis on July 1st or something like that. And Buffalo Bill Cody had essentially rented out several of the train cars that were not like the sleeper cars, you know, the Pullmans where people were sleeping overnight or dining or whatever. But he had instead guns and lots of ammo. Lots of really big guns with really big ammo that took a lot of powder per shot to charge and so forth. And some of them were this size, and you would just go across the Great Plains, so like Flint Hills of Kansas, right? It's open prairies, big rolling hills for miles and miles, days and days on the train. And when you guys ran across some buffalo, hey everybody, there's some buffalo coming up. Let's all go to the killing cars, and everybody just takes shots at them. The train doesn't even slow down, right? So this is trophy shooting because there's this sense of, man, there are so many tens of millions of bison. Let's just, you know, let's satisfy our lizard brains by making things go bang loudly and watching, you know, bison heads sort of splatter and turn into pink mist, right? It was the Call of Duty of its time. Instead of 360 no-scoping or Fortniting and stuff like that. This is what people kind of did at the time. And it worked. It was effective, right? We took buffalo down from tens of millions across the interior of the United States and Canada down to, something like 100,000 individuals? Right up against that minimum viability line of, if we have any fewer bison left than this, when we try to repopulate, there's not enough genetic diversity, and all the bison that we would have left are increasingly super inbred, right? We got right down to that threshold. We went right past that threshold with these passenger pigeon hunting guns, which were so heavy they needed to be pintle mounted, right? So put on a ball and socket so you could just sort of aim the gun without having to carry its heft or deal with the massive kickback of a weapon this size, okay? So this would be like a gun the size and kickback of like an APC's, you know, anti-personnel cannon, right? Anti-infantry cannon. Like, this is pretty bananas. And so there are testimonies of people going out to hunt with weapons like these, and with a single trigger pull, getting dozens to up to 100 animals in a single shot, right? Imagine how much bird shot you can put in an 1.5 inch diameter barrel. Just like lots of powder, lots of bird shot. So anyway, I started blasting, right? And it doesn't take long at that level to bring down enough birds to feed Chicago, right? There was a human benefit for part of this, and the rest of it was just absolutely wasteful sport shooting. So it is kind of in 1890 where the country as a nation a nation of nations has to kind of get together and think and reflect on, wow, we can really hunt our food out to the point of our starvation. Okay? So this is a big deal. This is a very big deal. This is a seismic shift or tectonic shift in how people conceive of our natural resources, right? This is fun. This is really, really fun. Like, man, if you ever have the chance to rent a high caliber weapon like out west, you can rent like a military Humvee with a mounted machine gun on it for the day, and as long as you can afford all of the freedom seeds, then you can just drive around out west and just shoot at nothing or anything, because there's plenty of space out west to do that. It's lots and lots of fun. Like, it's not anything good or evil about shooting guns or target shooting or anything like that, but we just have the capacity to do great harm with it, right? So that's kind of the reality that people are just starting to wake up to around 1890. And so the public conversation is having to confront that, right? So we get a lot of dark humor from political cartoonists, even starting back then, but this is a much more modern example of that. Okay? So this is what catalyzes this really sort of big national debate between two massive giants of our field. Everybody has heard of John Muir before? Hands up. Anybody not heard of John Muir before? Okay, cool. Let's talk about John Muir for a sec. Everybody has heard of Gifford Pinchot? All right. So the way these two gentlemen kind of shake out for purposes of our discussion is that Muir was an eccentric inventor living in California and essentially being the farm manager for his wife's family's very large, very prosperous farm just west of the Sierras. So kind of think Imperial Valley, where we grow, millions of pounds of almonds and vegetables most of the year and so forth. And John Muir is a very spiritual guy, like super duper into God. And he believes that God is super duper into him. Gifford Pinchot is kind of more of an engineer. So we have I believe he was from the Yale School of Forestry, also trained, or maybe he founded the Yale School of Forestry, also trained over in Europe, where silvicultural practices out of the German school had to be adopted much earlier than we had to think about in the United States, because Europe's been settled, developed for a really long time, and they've had to steward their resources and do things like figure out conservation, sustainable cut rates and so forth, right? So conservation. John Muir blows off steam, blows off the stress of being a very busy farm manager in the late 1800s by going up into the Sierras back in the day where we didn't have quick dry clothes. He was just in like wool and cotton, and his leather boots or shoes, and he would often go up into the mountains for days at a time with nothing but hardtack and tea mix in his tea kit. And he came to understand, or he came to believe very strongly and passionately, that what we are capable of as a species is looking a lot more to him like destruction than it is stewardship. So John Muir's sense of how we need to be interacting with stuff in the late 1800s is preservation. John Muir reads something like Of Man and Nature from 1864 and thinks, okay, well, again, he's a very spiritual person. His thought process might go something along the lines of, well, if God created this beautiful garden of a planet for us and then put us in authority over that at the end of, chapter 3 or 4 of Genesis, to be stewards, to be caretakers, to be essentially husbanders of the garden, to use some archaic language, well, we are not doing a great job of that if we are cutting down our forests and polluting our waters thereby and hunting all of our passenger pigeons and bison to the point of extinction or to the edge of it. And if God put us in charge of all of this stuff to take care of it, well then absolutely anything that we do to degrade this beautiful, irreplaceable gift that we have been given by God, anything less than preserving that to the absolute best of our ability and knowledge and wisdom is evil. It's wrong. So John Muir sees it as a divine mandate to be a good forester. And to him, being a good forester is not cutting down a lot of trees. He was kind of a wild child, and anecdotally, he was known for going up into the Sierras, up towards tree line, And then when, intense electrical storms would blow through the area, he would climb up into a tree during these storms just to be a little bit closer to the action. Right? Because God created all this stuff. Let me get a little bit closer to God, even when it's scary. And so he is in the sort of third quarter or fourth quarter of the 1800s. Kicking around a place that is now in what is Yosemite National Park. Has anybody heard of Hetch Hetchy Valley before? Okay, has anybody covered this in any other classes? All right. This is the defining story of American forestry. Let's go through it here. So, Hetch Hetchy Valley is a beautiful, steep-walled, glacially sculpted valley. So it's got these almost vertical walls and sort of characteristic U shape at the bottom, right? It was filled with seawater at the bottom. We call it a fjord. And it is gorgeous. It is so beautiful that the Native Americans who live in and around what is now Yosemite National Park legitimately think of Hetch Hetchy Valley as a genuinely sacred place, where the boundary between what is divine, what is cosmic, what is beyond time, where the gods are, that divide is a lot thinner in Hetch Hetchy Valley. It's a sacred place. And John Muir agrees with that. He sees why people would think that. He's like, this place is so amazing, it's so beautiful, that humans could never match this. Look at the best cathedral we have ever built. That's a joke next to the beauty and the sacredness, the irreplaceability of Hetch Hetchy Valley. And he felt very strongly about that. Around the time that he was falling in love with Hetch Hetchy Valley, which is again around what is now Yosemite National Park, there was a catastrophic fire in San Francisco, at the far end of the state, hundreds of miles away. And San Francisco, as you may or may not know, is referred to as the Bay Area, right? San Francisco Bay is right on the Pacific coast. And San Francisco, and pretty much every other city in the country at this time, made out of a bunch of houses and other buildings, office buildings and such, hotels, all made out of timber. And San Francisco is also really steep, really hilly, right? So it's the place where you see all those old 80s action movies of cars like jumping, not just on like city streets, like jumping over things by hitting these streets at high speed, streetcars, going up very steep slopes on cogs and so forth. There's a catastrophic fire that gets out of control in San Francisco, and a huge chunk of the entire city is destroyed overnight. Like, it completely outstrips the ability of those fire crews to handle that, right? We don't have modern pump trucks, and we don't have ladder trucks, and water weighs a metric ton per cubic meter. So this city right on the ocean, with millions of cubic miles of ocean water available to fight this fire, the fire happens because, man, those crews can't haul water up those steep hills fast enough, and it just gets completely out of control. And the entire country is horrified by this, because pretty much every other city in the United States is facing the same thing. We're all just one catastrophic fire away from a whole ass city getting destroyed. So it kicks off this national conversation, this debate on what to do about that. And folks like Gifford Pinchot suggest, hey, we got more water than we know what to do with. It's all locked up in the snowpack of the Sierras on the other side of the state. That's a couple hundred miles away, right? But it's all uphill. So if we just cut some canals, some waterways, from one end of the state to the other, we could not lose a San Francisco every time there's a fire. Wouldn't that be great? Wouldn't that save a bunch of human lives? Wouldn't that prevent progress from getting utterly wrecked just because we have water right there and we can't haul it up fast enough? It's too heavy. And the whole country goes back and forth on this because it's hard to argue against, saving human lives, protecting human property, all this development, right? We gotta now cut down a whole bunch more trees to rebuild most of this entire city of San Francisco, which is an important port city. It's an important city with the 1800s gold rushes, right? A lot of people are filtering through San Francisco to head to California and seek their fortunes and so forth. And the climate there, pretty good for a lot of things. So it's a nice place to live, except when it's burning to the ground. And this gets all the way up to the office of the president. So Gifford Pinchot is saying, okay, well, in order to access and sort of regulate, make usable, accessible year-round, all of that water that's around places like what will become Yosemite National Park and so forth. Right? We don't have a National Park Service yet, we don't have a Forest Service yet, we don't really have major government organizations to deal with stuff like this, so it's all being sort of figured out on individual cases like this. Pinchot says, okay, well, we're gonna have to give somewhere. Let's transform the natural capital of Hetch Hetchy Valley, which is this deep, steep-walled valley with lots and lots and lots of snowpack that melts a little bit each year. So if we just put a dam across the mouth of that, it wouldn't even have to be that big of a dam, and we get a ton of water out of it. And when we're not fighting fires very occasionally, well, we could irrigate millions of acres of kind of marginal farmland that's okay for ranching. But if we could just get some more water in there, well, now that's full quality farming land, not just marginal dry grassland for beef. And Muir is on the other end of the thing and is saying, no. If you have a fire, you're not going to demolish all of your churches to put a pond for firefighting in the middle of your city. You're not going to do that, right? Because the churches are more important. They're who we want to be, more than what we need. One famous line from Muir is, humans were created by God to need places to play in and to pray in. He explicitly connects the highest order things that humans can do to outdoor recreation. And he says, if you damn Hetch Hetchy, you are basically damning our souls to hell, because you are choosing to do a mechanistic, just earthwork kind of a thing, and it is an abomination against this beautiful natural cathedral that God put here that you could never match anyway. So you're taking it and actively making it worse. You're destroying that which is good to make something that is barely serviceable. And a lot of people agree with Muir. A lot of people agree with Pinchot. So Muir took his fight to the people, and he founded, maybe you've heard of this, the Sierra Club. Now it's an international organization that advocates, it supports science, and it is all about land and resource preservation. And it's a very popular movement. It's over 100 years old, and the Sierra Club is active here in Southern Illinois, right now to this day. And he got letter writing campaigns. He used the Sierra Club to mobilize thousands of people to write letters to Congress, to write letters to the president and say, look, there's like 20 different ways we could solve this San Francisco problem and this farming irrigation problem. And only one of them is a terrible idea involving damming up the Hetch Hetchy Valley. And with kind of that sloganism, that jingoism of damn Hetch Hetchy Valley and damn all of us, he brings into the public mind the idea that, yeah, we can do all of these things, but should we? What are we meant to do? What is good? What is right? What are we needing? What are we wanting? What should be worked towards instead of compromised down to, right? Gifford Pinchot, on the other hand, is very much a nuts and bolts, dollars and cents. Hey, we need X numbers of board feet of timber. He is later appointed essentially the first director of the United States Forest Service, what will become the United States Forest Service, around the year 1900. And his sense was, look, we've got a problem, we've got a solution. If we just build a dam, we can solve multiple problems and just kind of be done with it and move on and work on everything else. Okay? So, Gifford Pinchot was trying to solve problems for the most people at the least cost for the longest period of time. This is the utilitarian mindset or philosophy, right? We got problems, we got solutions, let's pick the most optimized out of those solutions and drop it into place and move on to the next thing, right? A very utilitarian, very practical, nuts and bolts kind of a mindset. That evolved into the conservation mindset, the greatest use, the greatest output for the most people for the longest period of time. And so it's around this time that tourism at Niagara Falls and Horseshoe Falls is blown up. And we have the World's Fair in places like Chicago, where we are looking to the future in the late 1800s. This particular picture is from 1933, but same idea back then. And this is also the period in which those railroad companies, with those railroad land grants we were talking about last week, are building these massive, hundreds of rooms log cabins called lodges at what are becoming the first national parks, again, before we have a National Park Service created. So all of this is happening at the same time. Preservation versus conservation. Cows and sheep not mixing, right? Fighting in the streets, not really fighting in the streets, but absolutely fighting in the cabinet. The private meetings with, at that time, a crucially important president, President Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, the first one. All right, he's president from 1901 to 1909, and he's meeting with Gifford Pinchot, and he's meeting with John Muir. He's receiving letters from this national letter writing campaign from the Sierra Club and other folks like that. Audubon Society is active at this time. And Theodore Roosevelt, in this case, ends up siding with which guy? Anybody know? Pinchot. Yeah. He decides to go with the practical solution for a practical problem for some of his constituents. And to this day, Hetch Hetchy remains dammed, and serves a utilitarian water provision and irrigation purpose. So Muir died right around the time that that decision was made. He died brokenhearted. In fact, he died shortly after the president sided with Pinchot. As far as he knew at that time, he had lost the battle, and it just crushed him. And you gotta understand, this guy got into preservation, Muir got into preservation as a part-time inventor. He was inventing things like, this was the time in the late 1800s where people would invent like those Looney Tunes style machines to get you out of bed automatically in the morning by, like, you know, a candle burning down and then, you know, burning through a piece of twine that, you know, holds the bed down, and so the bed ejects you when the candle burns down too much, whatever. He got into all of this stuff when one of his machine contraptions, probably a piece of farm toolery or whatever, it sort of blew itself apart and shot a sliver of metal into his eye. So as he's cupping his punctured eye and the intraocular fluid is leaking out into his palm, he has that prayer that some of us, I hope none of us ever have this moment, but he's like, God, if you let me live from this, right? Ladies and gentlemen, we don't have any antibiotics. This could be a death sentence for him. He says, I will devote my life to protecting your creation. And he eventually does recover from that and starts this movement, right? So he's passionate. This is a core central value for him. And so when he sort of receives the decision that breaks the other way in favor of Pinchot's conservationist mindset, he just kind of crumples up and dies of a broken heart shortly thereafter. But the historians kind of characterize what happened next around 1905-ish, so while Roosevelt's still in office, as Pinchot won the battle on Hetch Hetchy Valley. But Muir, because he mobilized a groundswell of people from across the entire country and helped educate people on, hey, places like Hetch Hetchy Valley exist in the first place. They are beautiful and irreplaceable. They are unsubstitutable. We have to set some of these apart. We can't just farm and mine and drill everything. We just can't. We're better than that. We're meant for more than that. So, historians have characterized this as Gifford Pinchot winning the battle of Hetch Hetchy, but Muir winning the war. So Muir launched a movement. Gifford Pinchot launched the Forest Service. That make sense? All right, cool. So the United States National Park Service, again, still doesn't exist until 1916. But in the decade running up to that, when this Theodore Roosevelt guy is in office, all of a sudden, now we have a vocabulary. We have words like conservation. We have words like preservation. And now our national conversations can never be the same because we've just finished shooting all of the passenger pigeons, carrier pigeons to oblivion. Almost shooting all of the bison to oblivion. And a whole bunch of other native species. All kinds of different songbirds, insects, and so forth, right? That stuff is starting to go away. So, in the middle of this battle, Theodore Roosevelt, who, y'all, I may say this at other times about other people, but this is the only time I can really mean it. Theodore Roosevelt was metal as fuck, right? This is one of the few humans who has ever been shot and then, while bleeding, finished his campaign speech that day, right? This guy headed a group of cavalrymen called Roosevelt's Rough Riders, right? This guy was a monster. And he used his absolute love of the outdoors to go as hard as he could in the direction of conservation. Like, he didn't just side with Pinchot, he set up what would become the United States forest system with Pinchot, right? He didn't just solve a problem, he created an agency, or a service within the agency. He also laid the groundwork for creating the national park system under Muir's concept of preservation, right? So now we have multiple tools for multiple parallel, and now they don't need to be competing missions. It doesn't have to be one winning or losing versus the other. Now we need both. And so Roosevelt is laying the groundwork for it. 10 years later, or 7 years after he's out of office, Congress creates the United States National Park Service, and at that point, now we can meaningfully preserve some of these unique and exceptional places. And indeed, the big polygon that we now call Yosemite National Park is drawn around Hetch Hetchy Valley, still flooded, still dammed. The rest of it is run as a preservation mission place. All right, so we'll end on the United States 1906 Antiquities Act, which gave Theodore Roosevelt, as the first president in office when it was passed, the ability to make a national monument, many of which can become national parks through an act of Congress, which is slow. He created the ability to make a national monument by executive order. By signing a one-paragraph sheet of paper, now 1 million acres at a time can just be set aside. That's a huge development. So we'll pick it up there on Thursday. Thank you very much. I'm around for questions for a couple minutes. Go vote. Be safe. See you Thursday. If you're here for doing resume stuff, that is up next at 11 down by my office.
Hey, if anybody wants to stay for